the opening days of 2371, a new vessel takes up residence at the remote Deep Space Nine, a Starfleet vessel, the like of which has never been seen before, a pure, unapologetic warship. Her name, Defiant. She is the first not only of her class, but a new line of starships, which are built towards a singular purpose, to confront and defeat the deadliest threat faced by the Federation, the Borg. At Deep Space Nine, the Defiant represents the spearhead of this tactically focused Starfleet and stands resolute as a symbol of Federation strength, a shield to her allies and a sword to her foes. Her motto lives up to her namesake with the defiant challenge, "Assimilate this." The massacre of Wolf 359 was a rude awakening for Starfleet. Up to that point, she had enjoyed over 50 years of tactical supremacy. The few conflicts that took place during this period were largely against smaller regional powers, who had no prayer against Starfleet's tactical dominance. So confident was Starfleet that she never deigned to deploy her top-of-the-line vessels, opting instead to match her second or even third-rate ships against the first-rate ships of her enemies. As time went on, this advantage bred arrogance, complacency, and ignorance. During this period, tactical aptitude among the senior officers dropped considerably, and increasingly few command officers would be promoted from the tactical division. This resulted in Starfleet tactics and doctrine stagnating during this period, with many officers simply relying on their ship's raw technological power in encounters. This resulted in extremely simplistic and predictable tactics and doctrine. And so, when Starfleet encountered the Borg in 2365, it became abundantly clear to Starfleet that they were tragically, nay comically, unprepared. And as a result, a new design board was convened, known as the Advanced Defense Research Division, or ADRD, headed by Commander Shelby of Starfleet Tactical. Unfortunately, in less than a year, the Borg would arrive in Federation space, and so far the only progress made by the ADRD amounted to a handful of design concepts and early prototypes, leaving Starfleet to fight the Borg with what was already at hand. This culminated in the bloody massacre of Wolf 359, in which a fleet of 40 ships, the largest assembled in recent history, was easily dispatched by a Borg cube in less than 10 minutes. When Commander Shelby returned to Starfleet headquarters, she immediately presented the CNC with a proposal, not only to bring the fleet back up to strength, since their forces were decimated at Wolf 359, but to do so with a new line of vessels devoted to one goal, to defeat the Borg. The CNC approved of her proposal, and she soon after formed a new design board, known as the Advanced Tactical Design Bureau, or ATDB, the majority of which was composed of Wolf 359 veterans, as well as designers and engineers who had previously been regarded as too unorthodox. It was precisely that kind of thinking Commander Shelby sought to foster, and so only a handful of personnel from the ADRD were carried over into the ATDB, allowing a fresh perspective while still benefiting from experience. The first order of business at the ATDB was to establish the weaknesses of current fleet doctrine at both an operational and tactical level. The failures at an operational level were previously known and had manifested during the Cardassian border wars, that being that there was no established groupings or large-scale formations within the fleet, making it highly reliant on top-down command structure, since most of the commanders had little experience of operating alongside one another, and this made them too slow to respond and support one another in combat. And so, it was determined that new tactical formations must be instituted, in which commanders are trained to operate as part of a larger, cohesive force. To assist in organising these new units and their training, Commander Shelby brought in Klingon military advisors who had experience with such operational units, going back more than a century to the 4 Years' War, in which squadrons of 3 to 5 ships were mixed with other classes into battle groups of up to 10. While Commander Shelby and other forward-thinking officers like Commodore Ross took inspiration from this structure, they did not directly copy it, as such numbers were only workable due to the loose nature of the Klingon command structure. Instead, squadrons were generally smaller, between 2 to 4 ships, and a wing itself would only consist of 2 component squadrons, allowing the commander, generally a commodore, to better manage the 2 squadrons. Equally, in a decision inspired by Klingon doctrine, squadron commanders were encouraged to take the initiative where necessary. However, in contrast to Klingon doctrine, in which wings, while somewhat specialized, feature a broad variety of classes, Federation doctrine instead opted for specialized wings with light, medium and heavy formations, which would then be mixed into battle groups under the command of an admiral containing between 3 and 5 wings. This desire for specialization became the primary motive of the ATDB, and it was derived from the experiences at Wolf 359, in which multi-role vessels had easily succumbed to the Borg, who could quickly adapt to the narrow range of tactics available to such vessels. Thus, specialization became a central pillar in the development of new designs. However, it was not to come at the expense of interoperability. All new classes should complement each other, though this came with the caveat as the classes should not become reliant on one another. The third pillar was adaptability. The new classes, while being specialized, should individually possess a degree of versatility in order to prevent the Borg adapting to their tactics. When brought together in a fleet of vessels, it was hoped that these 3 tenets of specialization, interoperability, and adaptability would confront the Borg with a multifaceted, highly complex threat, capable of adapting just as much as the Borg were themselves. On a technical level, several developments were to be issued universally and would be made available to the wider fleet in the form of refits. These would include the new Type 10 phasers, a new fire control computer which rotated phaser frequencies, and a similar computer would do the same for ships' shields, and the transmission encryption. However, the crown jewel of these new systems was the quantum torpedo. Developed with the express purpose of fighting the Borg, quantum torpedoes exploit the fabric of space-time, which the Borg's subspace field is unable to repel. It does so by employing a zero-point catalyst. Upon detonation, it creates a vacuum of zero-point energy, creating an already potent shockwave. Yet, it is when this vacuum collapses that catastrophic damage is dealt. As the vacuum is filled with zero-point energy, it releases a surge of energy, many times more powerful than a conventional photon torpedo. Quantum torpedoes are not without controversy. In 2370, they were heavily scrutinized by the Federation Humanitarian and Ethics Committee, as they were thought to constitute subspace weapons, outlawed in the Treaty of Algeron. However, after further investigation, the committee concluded that it did not constitute a subspace weapon, since it did no permanent damage to the subspace domain. In line with the new doctrine, it was concluded that swarm tactics would be the most effective means of countering the Borg, with 2 broad requirements issued. One was a set of classes that would be known as brawlers, engaging the cube at close range with the goal of distracting and destroying the cube's offensive systems. These ships would be heavily armoured and primarily rely on their armour for defence. The other set of classes were known as outboxers, which would engage the cube at range and employ their agility as a means of defence. Of these requirements issued by FleetCom, the ATDB proposed 2 classes, each for outboxers and brawlers, with the broad distinction that both categories would include a light and heavy class. As these new vessels began to take shape, Shelby came to the conclusion that a third archetype would be needed to bridge the gap between the brawlers and the outboxers. These would be known as counterpunchers, and again, a light and heavy class would be developed in this category. In late 2368, an unusual figure could be seen roaming the halls of the Antares shipyards. A tall, muscular Klingon sporting a forked black beard, and with a gold sash signifying him as the head of his house. This Klingon was Mandu, of the House of Katomag. His father was Kodar, the original designer of the now legendary Burrell-class bird of prey. Mandu, being well versed in his father's design, was serving as a technical consultant for the development of the new light brawler, which shared many traits with the iconic ship. Mandu primarily aided in the development of the propulsion system, applying the lessons learned from the service of the Burrell and improving upon them. This led to the warp and impulse units to be mounted separately, whilst remaining on a parallel plane. Mandu also had significant input on the design of the engine room, which was to accommodate the new Class 7 compact warp core. It is for this reason that the engine room would resemble a Klingon reactor pit. This light brawler would be the first to see a working prototype developed, with the USS Defiant NX 74205 beginning trials in early 2369. Unfortunately, she fared poorly in trials, almost shaking herself apart. The design was deemed overpowered and overgunned. The project head, Commander Sisko, argued that these issues could be resolved with sufficient fine-tuning. However, Shelby, pressured by the staff at Fleetcom, was forced to mothball the project in favour of its more promising rival. Yet, this was ultimately underpinned by the fact that much of Fleetcom was uncomfortable with such an aggressive design. This delay would result in the Defiant being the second to enter service, overtaken by the Saber class, which entered service in late 2370. Unlike the Defiant, the Saber class experienced far fewer growing pains during its development, being of a larger size and mounting the same Class 7 drive unit in a horizontal configuration. It was far better able to manage the power of its engine. She also benefited from employing already proven technology. Rather than bringing anything new to the table, the Saber simply brought together the technical advancements of the past decade into a singular, homogeneous design. At 180 meters long, 250 meters wide, and a mere 41 meters high, the Saber class presents an incredibly small silhouette, only slightly larger than the Defiant, and enjoying greater maneuverability and warp speeds. Serving as a counterpuncher, she is not weighed down by heavy ablative armor or powerful weapon systems, boasting a modest yet potent armament of 4 Type 10 phaser arrays and 2 torpedo tubes. This, combined with her agility, made the Saber an excellent destroyer and patrol vessel during the Dominion War, and she would prove adept at hunting down the smaller Jem'Hadar fighters. The Saber would soon establish itself within the fleet, forming the backbone of the newly formed Borg task force, with the prototype being commissioned in early 2371, followed by the first batch. The USS Jaeger, USS Pearson, USS Hussar, and USS Cuirassier later that year. However, her rival design, the Defiant, remained hot on her heels, being brought out of mothballs by Commander Sisko to spearhead second contact with the enigmatic Dominion. Unlike the Saber, the Defiant sports several new technologies, chief among which is its primary armament, 4 pulse phaser cannons. In many ways a response to the Klingon disruptors, these guns provide the Defiant with blistering firepower, and more power per shot and a rapid rate of fire, at the cost of range, accuracy, and being locked into the forward-facing mounts, though the Defiant, with its speed and agility, is easily able to make up for these shortcomings. This was all the more impressive given her second innovation, its ablative hull armour. Effectively serving as a form of reactive armour, ablative armour absorbs energy impacts and disperses it across the hull. However, with repeated impacts or a powerful enough beam, the armour will eventually be burned off. It also offers little protection against solid projectiles such as torpedoes. That being said, would prove to be an invaluable asset and prove to be the perfect counter to Borg cutting beams, and arguably allowed ships to survive encounters which would otherwise have been fatal. The second class to make use of this armour system was the Steamrunner class, launching in late 2371, fulfilling Starfleet's requirement for a heavy brawler. With a length of 376 metres, a width of 270 metres and a draft of 80 metres, the Steamrunner class heavy frigate is an exceptionally robust design, embedding the warp nacelles in the hull and placing the vulnerable navigational deflector at the back, allowing the Steamrunner to hang in a firefight far longer than most of her comrades, though this came at the cost of speed and manoeuvrability. Offensively, she lives up to the title of a brawler, armed with 9 Type 10 phaser arrays, 2 prow and 1 aft torpedo tubes, and carrying a significantly larger complement of torpedoes as well as additional phaser capacitors, all to enable the Steamrunner to fight continuously long after others have exhausted their weapons or shields. In many ways, contrasting with the Steamrunner is its cousin, the light outboxer, the Norway class frigate. 364 metres long, 225 metres across, and 52 metres high, the Norway is an extremely manoeuvrable ship for its size. With an extremely lean hull configuration, it is designed for hit-and-run attacks at range. It is essentially built around its primary weapon system, a single lance phaser cannon mounted in the bow recess, comparable in firepower to the main gun of a Vodka, although in reality it is in fact a response to the Borg cutting beam, designed to bore into the hull of a Borg cube. While formidable, the armament of the Norway pales in comparison to her bigger sister, the heavy outboxer, the Akira class. Not only boasting an impressive 8 torpedo tubes, allowing the simultaneous engagement of numerous targets and providing fire support for an entire wing, it also hosts a cavernous shuttle bay running through the center line, allowing it to carry up to 40 fighters within this bay, offering yet another threat to the Borg and further expanding her tactical utility. The Akira class entered service in early 2372. And while impressive, another vessel quickly stole the limelight from the Akira, entering service later that year. The crown jewel of the Anti-borg Starfleet, the heavy counterpuncher, the Sovereign class battleship. Learning from the lessons of the Galaxy class, the Sovereign is a leaner and sleeker design, arguably the first fast battleship, only later rivaled by the post-war Romulan Kachan class. While she boasts a formidable firepower, outclassing most ships of the quadrant, within her anti-Borg role, she is in fact more of a support class, akin to the Saber, bridging the gap between the brawlers and counterpunchers and filling in where needed. With the first 2 Sovereigns launching in mid-2372, consisting of the USS Sovereign and USS Enterprise E. The first 2 anti-Borg task forces were formed, with the Enterprise and Sovereign serving as their flagships. Each task force consisted of approximately 30 ships, split into 2 Saber squadrons, an Akira squadron, a Steamrunner squadron, a Defiant and Norway squadron. These 2 task forces would be rotated between patrol and other more typical duties such as science and exploration. Patrol was, however, the most critical duty fulfilled by this task force, standing as sentinels on the fringes of Federation space, as watchful guardians to deter any would-be invaders. Yet even when not on active patrol, the task force was expected to maintain its tactical skills, with 4 exercises a year at the wing level, and a full task force exercise every 2 years. Starfleet made sure to sharpen her sword. This proved fortuitous for Starfleet, as these skills would soon be put to the test when in 2373 a second Borg cube attempted to invade Earth, yet this time was successfully intercepted and eventually destroyed by Task Force Bravo. The new classes now proving themselves, emerging from this baptism of fire, ready to take on anything. Soon enough, this fleet would receive another call to arms, with the start of the largest and most destructive conflict in history, the Dominion War. While not the enemy originally envisaged, the Anti-borg line proved to be extremely effective, with the Defiant and Saber proving to be the bane of Dominion attack ships, the Norway and Steamrunner serving as a stalwart bulwark, and the Akira and Sovereign class outgunning nearly all their adversaries. In the course of war production, these classes would ramp up considerably, filling the ranks, and with so many produced, they would continue frontline service for the remainder of the decade, while some like the Sovereign, Saber and Akira would continue to see service into the 25th century. Others would find themselves superseded by newer, more well-rounded ships such as the Parliament and Valiant class, although these owed their success to the technologies pioneered by their predecessors. Even when demoted to second rate, these classes continued to see service and were well respected by their crews as highly reliable and robust designs, ready to muck in wherever needed, with no task being beyond their ability, making them rugged and reliable old workhorses. Ultimately, the Anti-borg Starfleet stands as a product of its times, while other Starfleet classes may take decades to fully mature and make a reputation for themselves. This generation of ships, more than any other, is reflective of the generation that built it. Ambitious, headstrong, and utterly indefatigable. Unwilling to take no for an answer, or be told that something is beyond them. And so the phrase, "assimilate this," was no longer the defiant challenge of an underdog, but a vindicated statement of victory. Victory against the darkness. Victory against fear. Victory for unity and the bonds of friendship. And victory for liberty.